Okay. And a win. Okay, good. So let's take a couple minutes. Let's see if anyone, hopefully that noise wasn't too horrible for whoever was hearing it. Let's think about social cognition if you can. I'm just curious what you all see in the classroom. That's partly why I put those prompts up in the beginning, just to get us thinking about our topic, but also to give me a chance to kind of understand where you're coming from, what you're encountering in the classroom in terms of kids and their skills and challenges along each of the constructs. So chat me if you can. Thank you, Kate. So, Kate, if you can expand just a little bit on that. So, what might you see, or what have you seen for a kid that seems like maybe doesn't have the strongest facility with social cognition components of? Alexandra's shyness. Okay. Okay, good. We'll take like 2 more minutes. I just want to give everyone time to give that question some thought. Bridget, that's interesting. Stares at everyone and freezes. Do you mean like when called on in class? Or if you can expand, Bridget, I'm curious what you mean. Kate, you have a student that lacks the ability to look his peers in the eyes when solving a problem. He also gets physical when he's upset and does not express his feelings with words, rather he uses his hands. Yeah. Okay, you have primary grades. Are you kinder? Okay. Good. We'll take 1 more minute and then we'll start to unpack some of what I'm seeing. Okay. Linnell is saying working in groups, especially in discussions or debate, can be challenging for sure. Student doesn't understand other students' concerns. He's more concerned with being the leader or doing everything his way. Okay. Can't see why his group mates get frustrated. Yes. Kate saying in play settings, struggle to share. Exactly. So, all right, good. Okay, it's 6:07, so we'll get started a little bit with this. I am going to guess I'm going to kind of run this session tonight as if most, if not everyone here, has not viewed the slides in the mini lecture for this week and done the reading, and that's totally fine. If I'm kind of speaking it to a place where you're like, I already knew all that, just let me know and I'll adjust what we're talking about. But there was one thing from what the materials include in the book. I don't know if Craig Pullman mentions it in his mini lecture, and I don't believe I mention it in mine. But it's highly relevant for a lot of you all I know who are participating this year that have primary grades, but it's also relevant, across grade levels, which is that there's some amount of social cognition that is developmental, right? So for people in kindergarten, working with kindergartners, this idea of perspective taking, so this number 3 component, understanding another's perspective, is not necessarily as available to a 5 or 6-year-old as that kind of thinking would be for a 10 or 11-year-old, something like that. So in terms of identifying the source of a student's difficulty in interacting with peers, of course, we always want to keep in mind what's developmentally kind of expected of that student. So there's that. That said, typically the kids that are struggling socially do stand out in some way in the classroom in that they're not able to negotiate interactions in a pro-social way with their same age peers. So sometimes, rather than, we don't need to necessarily look back into child development textbooks to understand what would be expected socially. The kind of general consensus along grade levels or the kinds of activities that kids at a certain age tend to engage in, it's pretty striking for those that have a weakness in those social areas, and sometimes even for those that have a strength in the areas particular, that can stand out quite significantly as well. I wanted to go back to kind of pick up on that point from what Kate was saying. So Kate was saying students have to share their feelings and solve problems. She's working with kindergartners, and she has a student here that lacks the ability to look his peers in the eyes when solving a problem. And then he gets physical when he's upset and does not express his feelings with words. Rather, he uses his hands. So this is a person who is having difficulty, it looks like, with several of these components potentially, but also with this idea of expressing, recognizing emotions in ourselves and others, and kind of managing his expression with others, right? So in a kindergarten classroom, frustration with that will likely look like moving to hitting or using their hands. As kids get older, difficulty with social interactions and problem solving will start to look a little bit different. I don't know who's here tonight might work with older kids or has examples. So if a kindergartner is frustrated in group work and problem solving, they're going to tend to move towards using their hands, and that's the kind of behaviors that we often see and notice in the classroom. What do older kids do when they're struggling socially? And I want to think now about kind of upper elementary and secondary grades. What kinds of things might we see for kids that are highly frustrated in their social interactions with peers, but don't necessarily take it to this physical place? Does anyone have thoughts on what you might observe? Okay, so Linnell's saying 8th graders shut down. Yeah, they leave the room, they destroy property, right? So then, not that that's a great thing, but that is a movement from knowing essentially that engaging in physical contact with other kids is totally socially unacceptable in school. And then very often as kids get older, they start to write on desks, they start to break stuff when you're not looking. Oh, interesting, James. So then 5th graders start to ruin the group work. So once again, they're moving from hurting an individual to taking it out on these kinds of objects that are actually more acceptable socially in school. Not that it's acceptable, but it's more acceptable than hitting peers. So that is the kind of lens that it can be really helpful to bring to observing kids socially and where they might have strengths and where they might have weaknesses in social cognition. It's going to show up differently for kids that are younger and kids that are much older. So there were these, I thought it was really interesting. I was kind of looking through some of my old materials that I've had. Someone, if you can mute, that would be awesome. Because I don't know if everyone else can hear it, but I hear a lot of background noise. Does anyone else hear that? Thank you. Oh, Nina, you're saying when you were with fifth graders, they would yell at their peers out of frustration, like, stop looking at me. Yeah, or you would see arguments break out in small group work when I've taught upper elementary grades, and I structured group works without necessarily fully structuring everyone's roles. We would be met with arguments among kids that took some negotiation. Yeah. And so some of that can be related to some of these components as well. So one of the ideas is this perceiving one's effect on others. So knowing that the kinds of... Oh, my voice is cutting out? Who's not on mute? Right, that's what I was thinking. Oh, okay. Was that Mindy? right, good. Is that better? That got better for me. I heard like a beeping. Okay. All right, good. Let me know again if that changes. Okay. Yeah, that was distracting me too. Okay. Thanks, guys. I see my phone made a sound, so now I'm looking at it. Okay. So I lost my train of thought. But now I'll come back. Oh, I was thinking about some of those arguments in small group work, right? So perceiving one's effect on others is a component of social cognition that can relate to this idea of struggling in group work. It could be something about managing the intensity and duration of interactions, understanding others' perspectives, recognizing emotions in others, and then this kind of general understanding. So these components of social cognition are not definitive in terms of what it means to socialize, and they align with, but are not identical to, the way that social cognition and social interactions are addressed in some of the kind of social skills programs that you might have encountered, or in other frameworks for thinking about kids' social interactions. So as with all of the other constructs that we've looked at over the course of this year, this is one way of organizing thinking around social interaction that provides a lens for understanding where a situation might be breaking down for a particular student, or where a student might have a particular strength that can be leveraged in the classroom. So I encourage you to think about these particular 6 components in terms of where you see evidence of them as relevant in your own practice and work with kids, but also where they map onto and where they intersect with kind of what you've already thought about in terms of social skills for kids and social interactions for kids, because it's very likely that these are going to have some kind of spaces of overlap and some departures from other frameworks from thinking about kids' social interactions. So I want to just show you, when I was looking through your materials earlier today to prepare for seeing you guys tonight, I came across a couple of ideas that were inside the materials from the Old Schools Attuned program that I just thought were really interesting and are connected to the idea of social cognition. So I wanted to share them with you and just see what you guys think. So it says here that from the perspective of the neurodevelopmental framework presented in these courses, right? This is what I thought was so interesting. The social requirements of the school day are easily as rigorous as the academic demands, which is kind of a bold statement, and I was curious about what you all think about these ideas. So from this perspective of the framework, social cognition is understood to be as important a construct to think about as each of the other constructs individually. And here's a few reasons why. One is that so students are constantly scrutinizing each other and evaluating their effectiveness and each other's social effectiveness in interactions. So it's a very unique experience for kids in school to be constantly and forever and always in the presence of peers that are your social, potentially, that are your social kind of outlet, and potentially is a source of joy and potentially a source of extreme upset and strain. Another idea around this is that, like, by design, schools deprive students of privacy, right? They're in public spaces with each other, and it leaves them perpetually on display. And that one tends to hit home for someone like me, where I'm a person who treasures having some time by myself and some time with others, and there's not as much of a respite from social interaction for kids in schools as there is even for teachers. Not that you have much privacy, and it probably doesn't feel like it if you're currently teaching, but there are moments where, like, you choose if you want to walk away for a moment during lunchtime, or you choose when you kind of shut down, or you choose when you tell the kids to do something independently. Those are choices that teachers make, and kids are subject to those and potentially have no moments during the day when they have a time to kind of regroup on their own if that's something that's important to them. Another reason the school day is very rigorous socially is that there's this constant mandate, and I liked the language. I did not write this. I pulled this language. There's the pressing mandate of avoiding public humiliation at all costs. So this idea that when you're with your peers, at all times throughout the day, and you're being challenged in these very real ways, academically and with your motor function and with your thinking and your memory, you're in these very public moments in potentially challenging and kind of risky situations that you're also being scrutinized by others around. And there's a huge emphasis for kids then of avoiding humiliation. And so some of those, I saw, was it Nina who was saying that shyness can come out for kids that are socially challenged. One way to think about or interpret shyness is to look for potential areas of challenge socially for students. So it may or may not be just that the student, is a quieter type of person. It may be that person is really struggling and has chosen to kind of withdraw as opposed to externalizing upset, frustration, fear, or risk-taking. Yeah, so Mindy's saying you never thought about how hard the school day could be for introverts. Yes. I have thought about this for a variety of reasons, and very similar to that kind of hidden idea of what the handwriting task simulation offered as a way to get our minds around what school might be like from the perspective of a kid who's struggling. For kids that are not as comfortable in a lot of interaction, school will just barrage you with assaulting activities. And that is something to really consider for the kids that are in your room, especially with that transition to the Common Core. Subject areas such as mathematics that traditionally had been something that a kid could kind of complete in isolation or at least in silence has now become a discussion-based topic or content area in the ideal sense, according to policy and research on best practices for math learning, and that removes that potentially removes that ability for kids to take that as a kind of personal time that's not as socially demanding. So all of this idea of learning through language and learning in projects and learning through talk and think, pair, share, and all of these efforts to help kids develop academic language by talking to each other really places kids that are struggling socially at risk. And that, to me, is kind of the big message that I wanted to share with you tonight, is that for kids that are struggling socially at school, many common classroom activities and routines are potentially interpreted by them as dangerous places for them to be and to participate in. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of think through with all of you, what kinds of activities do you yourself offer kids, or do you observe that seem like they hold a host of kind of these hidden demands on social participation? So feel free, if you can, I'm going to write this question down and then just chat it in there so we get some ideas. What kinds of classroom activities place high levels of hidden demands for students' social cognition and participation? See if you can take a minute and get some ideas out there, and let's just think about school from the perspective of a kid who may be struggling socially. Free play would definitely count in my mind, Nina. Yeah. And that's when you see those, and so then think about it and feel free to share, like maybe you have, because you have the shyer kid in mind or an introverted kid, what does that look like? What might free play be like? How about other ideas? So we've got free play, and I will list these here. Let's come down here. Okay, that's funny. Oh, silly. Mindy's saying college prep math curriculum is completely centered on the group of 4 students learning together and from each other. think introverts and extroverts alike can find great success in the program. Students with social cognition deficits could find a hard time. Spontaneous and collaborative communication, turn-taking, inhibition. Okay, great. So we've got free play, we've got college, prep, math, group work. I'm going to write. Jeanette, you have a shy girl. Okay, asking questions. When confused or in need of help. Yep. What else? Nina, you give them choices. Is this during the free play, right? Perfect. That was where we were going to go next. Linnell is saying greet and meets or jigsaw. Well, jigsaw assignments for sure. I don't know what greet and meets is. Nina, show and tell. Perfect. I mean, perfect, not that this is perfect for the kids, but these are perfect examples, right? What about this idea of think, pair, share? Thank you, Linnell. Meet and greets, exchanging information with, which is similar to think, pair, share too, right? I mean, it's different, but it's talking to it's like partner talk. I like that, meet and greets. I've never heard of that. Turn and respond, a mini whiteboard. Students can use a mini whiteboard or write in a notebook. Is that in addition or in as an option as well, Mindy? Because that could be a way to, yeah, so that's actually an interesting way to embed a support for students who are struggling is option to turn, I'm going to say think, share, or how about we'll call it, I don't know, in addition to think, then write. That's the Teachers College idea. So that's a way potentially to kind of support a kid who needs more help with social cognition, or to prevent that student from the suffering that can occur, having to endure the suffering that can occur when there is a social weakness or a social challenge. What else? Are there other ideas people have about Mindy? You serve primarily ELLs or students who have RFEP, both designated ELD. So I hear you in terms of, I'm reading Mindy's idea, and so those supports for ELD students or ELL students, I want to distinguish that from the talk that's demanded that taps into a student's weakness in social cognition. I want to distinguish that from a weakness in English proficiency, because it's entirely possible that a student has a weakness in social cognition and has limited English proficiency, in which case those two challenges would potentially interact. It's also possible that a student has limited English proficiency but has a social cognition strength, in which case those kinds of structured talk activities are typically going to be very beneficial. And so that is just another time to kind of make sure that we're distinguishing and honing in very closely to try and figure out like what is the source of a student's difficulty. There you go. Oh, James, yeah, okay, so sports and games, of course, those are classic, right? And those ones, for kids that struggle also with motor function, sports and games, there's a lot of correlation between social difficulties and motor difficulties that emerge on the playing field. in a way that classroom activities even maybe don't place as high demands on that. Group sports and games place probably the highest demands on these kinds of interactions. So let's think for a second, unless anybody else has another one, feel free to kind of jump in. But let's think about this idea of group work otherwise. So what kinds of ways, just from your own experience, if you think about a kid who's actually having difficulty with turn taking, social negotiation with peers, right? And peer understanding complex emotions. What kinds of supports would help a kid who's struggling with social cognition but is in a group? Because these activities, right, like jigsaw activities, show and tell, needing to ask questions, engaging in group work, free play, these are things that are the classrooms expect that of kids, right? Those are not going away. Or if they are, it's unlikely to happen really soon. So a way to approach that, and with the knowledge of how difficult and humiliating it can be for kids who are struggling socially, is to offer them supports directly in the activities themselves. And so I thought we might want to spend a couple minutes just starting to kind of brainstorm what kinds of supports would help kids who are struggling socially be able to participate in the common activities in the classroom that place high demands on their social cognition. Okay, so modeling, explicit modeling about how to talk. So we've got explicit modeling. One of your co-teaching teams has a quote of the month. Oh, that's really great. Celebrating, and focus on talk in groups. Okay. Kate, how can read alouds help? Can you expand on that? You're welcome to either write it or pop on the phone. Okay, sure. And do you have, so Kate's talking about using books to explicitly address emotions, is what it looks like in a social skills program. You see that often? Kate, do you have a thought? Gave her strategies to address anger. Are you talking about that in terms of this idea with group work, right? Explicit work to support students in, I'm going to write managing frustration, anger, and emotions. I'm manipulating your words, but if you don't want the way I wrote it, please tell me and I will change it. Good. Anything else for this idea of group work that people are thinking of? Yeah, anger. So Kate's tapping into something that I had in my experience as well. Oh, hold on one second, because the door just opened here. I can hear my daughter. I don't know if you can, but let me close it. So very often, and I'm guessing I'm not the only one, at least Kate and I have had this experience where without structure and guidance for social interactions, developmentally, young children especially, the groups break down, right? As kids start to get older, upper elementary, and then I've been seeing it a lot in middle schools and high schools, like in these secondary levels, it appears that often teachers expect that students have learned or bring knowledge of how to interact in a group in a productive and pro-social manner. That is not necessarily the case, and it often leads students to withdraw or express anger in a really inappropriate way or become frustrated and not get the content area work and learning done that is intended in the group design. Right? So anger is a big one when kids disagree and don't have these skills in problem solving and collaborative work. So some of that, these ideas here of these supports, right? One is to talk about what does it actually mean to participate as a member of a group and do some modeling of that and maybe give some language to what that means. So Mindy was talking about this quote of the month as a way to potentially house information and feedback for students about what good group participation looks like. You hold up an example that is pulled directly from kids' experiences. Another way to do that is a kind of less direct manner, but not irrelevant, is Kate's idea, which is to do this, like read a book and talk about emotional management, so that when those feelings arise in a group, kids can learn to engage in talk in a more productive and pro-social way. I happen to remember from my own childhood, maybe in 2nd grade, getting explicit teaching around using I statements, right? So when you do this, I feel that. When you talk over me in our group, I feel angry. We had to practice that as children when we were doing group work in my elementary school, which was a project-based learning oriented school. And so that kind of learning of how to participate in a group was really crucial and very obviously crucial in that environment. Some of these activities, like jigsaw, like show and tell, like expecting that kids ask questions or think, pair, share, they are not typically addressed as social tasks in my experience and work with teachers and in teacher preparation and in literature. They are typically they're looked at instructionally in terms of the value of kids being able to interact and talk socially, but the demands on kids that have a weakness in social areas are typically overlooked and could potentially shut those kids out from being able to learn. Side note, Mindy's recommending the movie Life Animated. Oh, great. I have not seen that film. Okay. His social skills coats. Oh, great. I would like to see that. If anybody else wants to take a look or reviews it before I do, let me know. Exactly. So we start to see, in the same way that differentiation or universal design is a way to kind of start with the kid that's the kids with the greatest needs, and then it turns out it's going to serve all. This idea of a child or a man who has autism, who has social cognition weaknesses and deficits that are potentially going to kind of stay with that person. Thinking of the world through the lens of a person who's really struggling that way can allow us to identify the kinds of supports that can really help. Not just that individual, but other kids that may be less kind of severe on the spectrum of thinking about what's challenging socially, but nonetheless could use some additional support. Mm-hmm. What about for something like show and tell? Let's think about a kid who's really struggling to be able to share with peers, and perhaps a kid who spends time being humiliated by peers and is less successful socially. So the show and tell seems like, on the face of it, right, a really fun activity where kids get to bring in information about their own lives, and a lot of kids really treasure that time in the classroom and thrive on it and look forward to it. And then there's kids for whom standing up in front of a group of people is one of the most humiliating experiences they could imagine, and especially a group of people who have been judgmental or evaluative over time and have potentially kind of teased or left that person feeling not great. Which unfortunately is not at all uncommon in schools. And, of course, once again, looking at it through the kids' eyes, kids spend years with each other, right? We get them for like 1 year, or maybe in certain circumstances, if you're a specialist, you might work with the same kid over a period of time. But for those kids, the same age grade mates are their world, largely. And so if we're thinking about show and tell even in first grade, it's very entirely likely that the audience for the show and tell is not a fresh audience for the child standing in front of them, and it can be quite difficult to step into that risky space. So what I want to just see if we can brainstorm some ideas is like, what could we do to mitigate the potential for upset for kids and to protect kids socially who are struggling a bit there? Does anyone have thoughts of like a routine or a structure or some addition to put into the show and tell that might support social interactions? I have a few. So I'll wait for you and then I'll give you some. Okay, so Robin's saying something like a sentence frame because that way everybody's having an opportunity to say things in the same way. Okay, so Bridget, you kind of give that social support, like emotional support by being with them. Share with a partner first. So I'm going to write share with partner first. And Kate, is that to prep? Oh, interesting, Mindy. Prepare, make a movie of the show. And so I'm going to say buddy or teacher partner for share. And Bridget, that's because I'm just expanding on your idea a little bit, is that the teacher can go up with the kid. You can also pair the child with someone of their selection. And I found that to be kind of powerful. Pre-record what they want to say. So pre-record and Lori, I'm going to add to that too if that's okay. Or practice what to say. And I've done a lot of things with kids where after a kid shares, what the class is tasked with doing is ask the class to respond according to particular prompts. So, for example, I would have kids respond, what's something new that you heard from this person that you didn't know before? And so it forces kids, as they're listening, to suspend at least some portion of judgment and evaluation socially and listen for something unique that student has to offer. Great question, Mindy. Well, in kindergarten, I have my own opinions. That's true. So, Mindy, you're talking about like what's the learning goal as a way to potentially kind of modify or differentiate? Yeah. Who uses show and tell that would like to share that? Otherwise, I can tell you what I've used, or like my thinking behind the learning goal of it. So in my experience with show and tell in kinder, right, Alexandra, is have the kids facilitate it. And that actually is aligned with what I have always taken the purpose of show and tell to be in early grades. And it's about helping kids develop social skills in terms of interacting with peers in an academic setting, but in a kind of friendly, kind, and appropriate manner. So it's a chance to lower stakes ways to do it. That's what I have traditionally done. So it's about what's something new we heard as opposed to who has like the best item to share. Show and tell can also give kids an opportunity to be featured who typically do not have a chance to share in front of the class if they're struggling academically. I've used show and tell as a way to kind of level the landscape of the playing field in the classroom because that's an activity that everyone can contribute to. And it also is an opportunity to guide social interactions among kids so that they get some practice in appropriate kinds of behaviors. And what do you mean by lower stakes too, though, Mindy? Like bring in, yes. Yeah, so you see what Mindy's saying is so to integrate the idea of show and tell into the content areas. Has anyone else done that? I have certainly done that, especially in social studies for units. I have done that extensively. I don't know if anybody else has. Oh, or a smaller group for lower stakes. That's interesting. Right. Who could find examples of languages other than English and bring them in? Exactly. So if you're working with the ELL students, that would be perfect. You know, if you ask them to bring in something that represents something from their own personal background. Right, Jeanette. The students can also give compliments at the end of the show to help students gain confidence. That is very much how I used it too, is so that then like, what's new that you heard? What's something that you could give a compliment for? It's practice. And in kindergarten, those kinds of foundational skills of responding appropriately to peers is really relevant. So that's how I used it in the past. Okay, good. Right, 10, exactly. And that's very important in primary grades. Now, that tends to get less attention as kids move into these upper grades. So it's show and tell, that might be something that it like takes time, and teachers work on it and will practice. Everybody show your 10-finger woo. Everybody give a compliment. Turn to the person next to you. What's one compliment you could say? Who wants to share one now? Things like that. In upper grades, kids are often kind of left to figure it out. And depending on the kinds of experiences they had in primary grades, they will be more and less prepared to negotiate those kinds of social interactions on their own. So I actually would just put it out there that for people who teach upper grades, it's almost more important to pay close attention to social cognition in the classroom, because it's often more expected, embedded, and not addressed. Whereas younger children, the curriculum itself is often oriented towards helping them develop the kinds of skills that they need, and teachers are often more oriented towards helping kids negotiate disagreements. If kids come in from recess and they're 6 years old and they've had an argument, the teachers will typically, unpack the argument with the kids. If kids are in 8th grade and they come in from recess and they have had an argument but it's not a fist fight, it's a question mark. Some teachers will work that through with you. Many teachers expect that you can figure it out on your own by that point. That may or may not be the case for the kids. And so really staying closely connected to the social experience of kids at school is crucial, especially for these reasons, where if we think about it, kids are experiencing school as a social endeavor in ways that teachers are typically not acknowledging. Teacher who gave a 2-question survey, who do you think should be the student of the week next week? Who do you want to be in your group? And the way she used it was actually to identify which students were never mentioned. Interesting. Yeah, so that's an interesting, and that's a really interesting example of a teacher who is, of course, attending to the social dynamics. And of course, we know from research and developmentally that adolescents and early adolescents, the social aspect of their experience is huge and dominates and can really throw people for a loop. I think we know from what we're seeing with social media and bullying and all the classroom climate stuff coming out that those kids are not done needing support when they get older, but they lose support, much like with motor function, right? So these early grades, we're really focusing on cutting and graphomotor skills and how we move our bodies in space, even in PE. As kids get older, there's just a kind of built-in expectation that you've got that handled, and that's just not the case in reality. Jeanette, when you were in 5th and 6th grade, your teacher had standing ovation where a student would randomly pick a stick and give the student... Sorry, I love that. Okay. Every student would stand and give that student a standing ovation. That's really interesting. Yeah, so that's the kind of contribution to classroom climate that it can really do a lot to create a space where kids are able to take risks. There's a lot more, I think, that teachers can do and do tend to do by using this kind of social cognitive lens to interpret kids' participation and behavior in the classroom. Because once you can kind of see where a kid might be struggling in interactions with peers and the severe impact that has, socially and on academic performance, in my experience, it's been difficult to ignore. And so all of these kinds of activities where we're kind of building kids up start to seem like a good use of time as opposed to extra. And that idea of taking time to develop a classroom climate that encourages risk-taking and social participation has impacts, especially as we move towards these kind of more discussion-based approaches to instruction. We cannot leave the kids to twist in the wind in that way. And then especially for kids who struggle with motor function, which in addition to the kind of very public nature of schooling in terms of your social interactions, motor function is extremely public for kids. So someone who's struggling with gross motor function, and they're awkward in space, or they're maybe have a bit of a floppy kind of way of being, or maybe they are a little more clumsy than their peers, that opens them up for a level of social unappealingness and humiliation from peers that is beyond it's beyond what most kids would experience, even just from a kind of academic difficulty. And so then what I think is important to also keep in mind, of course, as with all the other constructs, is then the interaction, right? So then we want to think about, what does a student lose if they're shut out from group participation due to a social cognition weakness or an unaddressed kind of challenge that doesn't have a support in place. So if we're thinking about group problem solving and there's someone who's just shut down, they're just shut down due to social difficulties, the sacrifice of that person's learning is not to be overlooked. So then when assessing someone's knowledge on a topic in a dysfunctional group dynamic, what are we really assessing? That student's participation and contribution to the group, or that student's ability to navigate a very kind of treacherous social situation? And so not to acknowledge that for the students and not to provide them with means through which to engage socially with each other, especially for those that struggle, is, in my opinion, not fair to them. It's not equitable practice. Sorry, social Hunger Games. I was laughing at what Mindy said. So having seating charts always. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so different teachers have different approaches. I think if everyone were to just take a moment and see if you can remember from your own experience in middle school or high school one or more times that were humiliating socially. I know I can. That stuff stays with you, right? So picking your own seats, it might not seem like a huge deal, or it might seem like letting kids choose where they want to be is giving them options that they would really desire. And for some kids that may be the case. And then there's the kids for whom it's not the case. So weighing those costs versus the benefits of kids having some kind of structure to step into is really important. So I have a question for you guys that will take us into potentially what we'll do. I have two questions for you, actually. The first is, does anybody already start to have insights into a kid that the kid you selected for your neuromotor function and related social connections? So what I mean by that is, like, if you pick someone that's struggling with motor function, if you bring a social cognition lens to that person, does anything new seem to come up? Or do you notice there are social impacts of a motor challenge? And if so, would you just tell us a little teeny bit? Okay, or not. So when you do that update in week 5, you have time, then I bet some things will come up. But my other question to you is, how many people here use a social skills curriculum at your school? And if you do, what is it? Modified gait or motor challenge? Okay, do you guys see what Mindy's saying? So she's saying her student has this kind of visible motor challenge with her gait. And so one of the supports to put into place for that person is to help her articulate and, in that sense, kind of advocate for herself by explaining how that works for her, maybe like what the source of the modified gait is and what she does about it. Perfect example. Thank you. Social skills training work? Just curious. Right? Second step. That's a lot. Those are big. I think my kids' school. Muttigrees? Oh, Muttigrees. That's new. Second step I'm familiar with. Muttigrees? Is it like does it have a dog icon or something? Like, is it? Okay. Interesting. I'll look that up too. Any other ones? Oh, that's cute. Okay. Social and emotional learning through the use of animals. Oh, okay. So Muttigrees is focused primarily on empathy. Okay. Second step is not just empathy. Second step is like character, correct? And you have a therapy dog at school. Okay. That's cute. Okay. All right, I just wanted to look into that. So those programs, just PBIS. Okay. Those kinds of programs like Second Step and then Mud Agrees maybe too, but that's new for me. I can't. There's like a few other ones that I usually see. In my experience, there's value in many of those programs in terms of especially kids having a kind of common vocabulary for what kinds of social expectations there are in terms of outside play and ways of interacting with each other at the school. However, I have found that without kind of explicit connection in the classroom about how, like, what does it look like to demonstrate empathy in group work, kids have difficulty connecting those dots. So, they'll have the therapy dog, maybe, right, or they'll learn about empathy with animals, but there's a certain amount of work, cognitive work, that they typically, in my experience, need support with to draw the connection between having empathy for an animal and having empathy for someone that I am angry with right now. Yeah, I don't find them that able to generalize personally. This might just be me, but I think that there's a certain amount of work that teachers can do to help kids draw those connections. And I think that especially in the academic realm, in the classroom, there's a host of other factors going on for kids. And I think it's difficult for them to recognize math as a social activity, this project as a social activity. They might be able to get the connection between the kind of social structures and free play, the social program and sportsmanship on the field, right? Like, what does it mean to be like a good sports partner? But I have found it much more difficult for them to see what does it mean to be a good partner when I'm giving peer feedback by drawing on those skills. Right. To me, it makes sense that they need feedback on that, but I don't often see that attended to in the classroom. So I will just encourage you guys this week just to observe, just observe if it comes up for you. What is going on socially, academically in the classroom or in your work with kids? So to what extent are social difficulties being attended to or not? And in what ways do those challenges or attended challenges have an impact on a student's participation in learning? Because there's a huge amount of crossover there, and there's a lot of effort and energy being put into anti-bullying programs and character development programs, which is great, but doesn't necessarily directly line up with what we're seeing in classrooms. And there's a lot of leverage for kids to feel like full members of a learning community. There's a lot of leverage there, I think, that can work in the reverse direction to help kids develop empathy when they feel like fully accepted and participating members of their classroom community. So it's not just the feedback one way from the social skills that kind of makes its way into practice, but practice itself of those kind of pro-social, social climates in a learning environment can spill out into these other less structured areas. So I kind of wanted to share that with you. And there's two more things I want to tell you. What were they? And then I will let you go. I just want to ask you, does anybody have any questions about any of your assignments, the learning activity assignment, any of the other assignments? I tried to modify this class. We do listen to your feedback, by the way. I know I've told you that, but I really mean it. And so I tried to balance your assignments this time to make sure everybody was able to not feel overburdened. So you can always communicate with me about that stuff. Some people have contacted me if you were having difficulty getting stuff in. Totally open to that, okay? Cool tools. I'll look that up. Okay, so that was one thing. The other thing is, now I remember. So next Thursday, we have to rearrange. It is my son's kindergarten play, and it is from 6:30 to 8:30, and I have to go. So we need to change. Yeah, it's going to be really cute. And Wednesday night is a talent show rehearsal for them. So I am rescheduling our final session. I apologize for the late notice. I received late notice as well. I sincerely apologize. But we're going to have it next Tuesday night, 6 to 7. And if you can join us, that would be awesome. If you cannot join us, then I will definitely, I will film things. It's really cute. If you cannot join us, it's totally fine. You can always watch the recorded session. And once again, please accept my sincere apologies for giving you late notice to switch the day. I don't like it when people do that to me, but it was unavoidable. So I will send a note out to the whole group in the next day or so, just to remind you of that switch. And otherwise, just contact me if you have any other questions. And does anybody else? And I feel that once you watch Craig Pullman's video and just read the couple pages for this week, it's gonna social cognition and its connections to the other constructs, I think, will probably start to be glaring, or at least they have been for me as I've started to engage in this study with this work. Oh, good. Oh, good. Yeah, those pages are really helpful. And feel free, I don't know if people read other sections of the book. We didn't assign the whole book, but it's got some valuable stuff in there. So skim around if you're feeling interested. All right. Well, if that's it, then I will just say thank you all for coming. You're great. And I will see you on Tuesday, or else I will be posting this recorded video for you afterwards next Tuesday. Have a good night. You guys are awesome. Stop this.